Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Storytellers podcast. In this episode, I had the pleasure of talking to an old lecturer of mine from the Monash School of Business, Choo. Jason is currently implementing a change in his course over at Monash, whereby exams are being removed and lectures are being moved to a purely online forum as part of a new pedagogy being instituted by the Vice Chancellor. This conversation centered around the assumptions implicit within the changes to this pedagogy, as well as addressing the assumptions already made and present within the current system. We also discussed the conflicting motivations of profits versus pedagogy and what's really at play here, and the implications and consequences that this might have for students going forward. Overall, it was a very interesting and stimulating conversation. As you will hear, Jason is a very thoughtful and insightful and caring person, and it was a real pleasure to talk to him on this topic and hear his thoughts and to share some of my own, as it's a topic that interests me quite a lot. So, without further ado, I give you Jason Choo. So, Jason, thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So, to kick things off, perhaps you could give us a little bit of an introduction as to who you are and your background and how you come to be speaking about the topics that we're going to go over today.
Oh, thanks, Lucien. Just a little bit about me. I'm a lecturer at Monash University. I've been at Monash University for 20 years now. And before that, I was a student at Monash University. I did banking and finance there. Then after my studies, I went to Singapore to work for a little bit. And I was in industry and private banking for a number of years. Private banking is where you're selling stuff to rich people. And after several years of that, I decided to come back to Australia for an easier life in academia. That's what I do full time. I also run a property business with my wife as well too. And yeah, I've been involved with that for the past 15, 20 years.
Cool. So, an extensive background, not just in finance, but also in pedagogy, which is essentially the topic of this podcast. And maybe it's also worth distinguishing that you're not just a lecturer, but also a unit coordinator. So that's still a correct title?
Yeah, that's right. So apart from most lecturers are also unit coordinators, or the title is chief examiner. So we're in charge of the curriculum, of deciding the assessment, deciding the structure, as you mentioned, the pedagogy, how things are taught, and also we're required to be the content experts as well too, in terms of deciding what's taught and making sure that everything aligns up with what the department requires of the unit.
Yeah, great. So, what's happening over at Monash at the moment? The last time we talked, there was some interesting developments that are about to take place and which you're currently working on. So maybe we could just jump right into that. What's going on over there that's so worth talking about?
Yeah, so Monash University has gotten a new Deputy Vice Chancellor of Education. That's Sharon Pickering. And like lots of new Deputy Vice Chancellors, she had a bold vision as to where she wanted to move the education of the university. So we have a deputy vice chancellor of education, we have a deputy vice chancellor of research as well too. So in the education space, in the education front, she really wanted to move things forward to better align the university with the outcomes that the industry expects of its graduates. And to do that, one of the things that she wanted to do was to completely realign the thinking, the expectations, and the assessment. So, in a nutshell, the result of that realignment was that exams are being removed from the majority of units within the university wherever possible, because the prevailing thinking is that students don't actually need to sit an exam when they go for a job interview. Students need to be able to present themselves, to communicate, to articulate, to apply what they've learned, to have self-awareness, to develop intellectual emotional maturity when they're in a job interview. Exams don't really contribute to that. Very few people actually have to sit an actual exam when they go for a job interview. I don't think psychometric tests really count. We still have tests. What we don't have is an exam. And also when people are working in the workplace, an exam isn't really also part of the milestones or the criteria that working professionals have to undergo on a regular basis. So that's a big step in a new direction, the removal of exams, and also the removal of lectures. And the removal of lectures comes from uh, um, the evolution of how students consume education. And that is, students are choosing not to go to lectures anymore. And we can talk about reasons about why a bit later. And instead, we're moving completely towards the so-called flipped classroom model, where the lecture is actually delivered as what they call asynchronous content. In other words, it's taught through various activities, self-paced, online by themselves, and students only go to class for their tutorials, where they actually apply the material. And the tutorials will be expanded to usually 2 hours. So it's more of a workshop that's followed up
Mm,
by post-class material. Yeah, so those
mm,
are two of the really big results to come out of this entire process.
mm. Well, maybe let's start with there's exams and lectures there, and they're both their own thing, but they both tie sort of back to the same thing. So maybe let's start with lectures with um, the theory behind the theory behind getting rid of lectures is that no one is attending lectures. Well, you have a severely reduced proportion of students attending lectures, and so it's economically more efficient to simply then not have those lectures, and supposedly you're not losing anything by no longer having those lectures in person. So maybe firstly, what are your thoughts on those two points?
Yeah, absolutely and completely agreed. It's the conflation of two important phenomena. The first one was started to occur approximately 20 years back when lectures were being recorded. So the issue with lectures and how they've traditionally been conducted is lectures have been passive one-way communication. So you'd imagine a lecture is in a big hall. You've got hundreds of students in there. You've got a single lecturer who's at the front, being the so-called sage on the stage, delivering content and speaking. The issue is that the way that which information is communicated is one way, passive. Now, when you do watch a lot of really good, engaging lectures online, you'll see that the lecturers are actually moving around the lecture theater. They're trying to engage people by having one-on-one conversations with people. Um, that's good. That makes for a more interesting, more uh, involved experience, but
Mm-hmm.
not for all students. And it takes a particularly talented lecturer to be able to deliver the quality and to connect with students in such a way as you would see, for example, famous lecturers um, on social media, YouTube, for example. And the simple fact is that the vast majority of lectures don't really have the language, the articulation, the ability, the interest
Mm.
to engage students well
Mm.
in that sort of format. I think the stories of lecturers being boring, students falling asleep in lectures are far more common and abound than students saying, "Oh no, it's a fantastic lecture. I was absolutely riveted for that 2 hours that I was there." So what happened was that because of the primary one-way communication, because the lecture experience was average for the most people. Um, when lecture recordings came out, lots of students said, "Well, why am I going to lectures? Because when I watch a lecture recording, I can pause it when I need to take notes, I can rewind it, I can fast forward it. I'm going to be watching the lecture recording anyway when I do revision, when I study for the test, when I study for the exam, when I need to go over material that I need to apply for my assignments. So, why should I go to the lecture if I'm not getting any value add out of that experience than simply watching the lecture recording? Because,
Mm.
again, for 99% of students in the lecture theatre, they're just sitting there listening. It is one-way communication.
Mm.
So this was a problem which has been around for a long time. Lots of students choosing and electing not to attend lectures because they can just consume the lecture recording at a pace and at a time of their own choosing and in the style of their own choosing. And ultimately, it got to the stage where lecture attendance had fallen so much that it just wasn't economical to run a lecture theatre, which could seat maybe 300 students, where maybe only 50 students were turning up. It also was a relatively big blow to morale to the lecturers to say, well, I'm delivering the lecture, but only 20 or 30 students out of a 300 student cohort are turning up. So it was sort is that a statement about actually my lecturing, or
Mm.
is that just an artifact of the phenomenon that I just described? So
Mm.
it's actually a combination of multiple things.
Mm.
So that was that particular phenomenon in and how it evolved and developed, and COVID really um, crystallized and catalyzed the change in the movement where everything went online. And it turned out that when we did everything online, we could do um, as good a job in terms of the lectures as we did when we were face to face, in terms of all the primary metrics that are used to measure student engagement. Um, it didn't really affect anything. So basically the higher ups came together and said, well, this is the trend anyway. We all know it. Students aren't coming to lectures. So we have what's called the flipped model, where instead of having a 2 hour lecture followed by a 1 hour tutorial, students consume the lecture in their own time in sort of pre class work activities.
Mm.
Could be a collection of lectures, videos that they consume. It could be mixed in with quizzes, mixed in with readings, and then they actually go to class to apply their material. So the classroom experience will always be there. This is what we call a hybrid model. And then after that,
Mm.
then, hybrid teaching versus purely face to face or purely online. Then after that, they go away and do more post class,
Mm.
usually at their own time online. So yeah, we have this model already. We have the catalyst of COVID-19 when everything was online, and also we have the phenomenon that less and less students are choosing to attend live lectures. So that's sort of the background behind it.
Yes. S- To speak to the idea of lectures, so I'm Because lectures are I definitely agree that it is very much the case that you have good lecturers and you have bad lecturers. That's immediately obvious as soon as you've spent. Just like there's good teachers and there's bad teachers, there's good lecturers and bad lecturers, and that becomes quite clear very early on in your university degree, and that's always going to be the case. Like lecturing is in some sense like it's a kind of performance, and a and kind of think of it as a performance, and in that sense, some people are going to be some people are good performers and some people are bad performers. Some people know how to engage an audience with their words and with their tone of voice and with the ideas that they're presenting, also with their body language. So some people are naturally great at that, and some people struggle. Like you yourself are a good example of this. You're quite a good lecturer. Um, you're not monotonous, and you know how to give inflection. You move around and how to speak to students. And so, but to go back to this trend of students decrease in attendance in lectures over the past 20 years, I imagine, or like a relative decrease in attendance, a decrease in attendance relative to the number of students that are attending a course or attending university, is that firstly, you've just got far more people attending university than you did 20 years ago, particularly, I think, in Australia. And so you've got a much larger cohort, and you've got a much larger need for lecturers and more lecturers. And so you're just naturally going to get dilution of quality likely through that, and I think a lot of students now aren't attending university for quite the same reasons that they may have been attending university a couple decades ago. I think you've got more students attending university as a much more casual and less sort of motivated pathway. It's more just something that you fall into doing, and so participation and engagement in that sense decreases, and so probably in the same, and this also might be reflected in the lecturers themselves and the number of lecturers and the manner in which people lecture. And I think you've also got a reduction in attention span, particularly in the past decade and a bit, through things like social media and technology. Attention span for people my age, a little older and younger, it's pretty terrible. It's having phones in a classroom now. I think that's just like in a lecture hall. That's just completely changed the nature of lecturing, the nature of engaging with the lecture or the teaching of knowledge. If you're just breaking it up every 5 or 10 minutes with this or that, you're not really engaged. You're not really there. So that's, I think, two things that perhaps that have contributed to this trend of a reduction in attendance. But the idea that you have some lecturers that are good and some that are bad, and therefore a lot of kids aren't getting the benefit out of lectures anyway that they theoretically should be, and so moving to just an online forum, to me, that just means you're getting a bad, not you're almost just getting a bad lecture every time. You might have a good lecturer delivering the lecture, but a good lecture in person is always going to be better than a good lecture on a video. You don't have body language, you don't have engagement, you don't have the persona and the character to draw you into a topic in the present. So I sort of wonder if there's potentially a trade-off there, in that just simply moving to this blanket online modality is simply, maybe you bring up your low bar a little bit, but you're capping your high bar in terms of what can be achieved. And in terms of the metrics that you mentioned that show student success or speak to student success, like I I guess I'd question how perhaps accurate they are, or just um, um, how useful they are from my experience, anecdotally, personally, and then as someone in a community with other students. Online lectures are great in that they mean you don't have to go to a lecture, and so you can just already commit less to that lecture to begin with, and then you can speed it up. And sometimes that's good and useful, but sometimes it's just a way for it to be done quicker and for you to have finished a task that you feel like you need to do. And so once you've done it, you've performed, fulfilled your obligations, kind of learnt some things. I'm guilt free. I can move on to the next thing. So I, I, I suspect that it's, yeah. I guess there's more questions there to its efficacy than is presented at face value in terms of as what the university might want to project. I don't know if you have any extra thoughts on any of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, just to add to your point about people lectures, you frame it as good or bad. I'd like to add to that and
Mm,
describe that, like any other body, like any other population of workers, even just looking at students, um, most lectures are just average. You
yeah.
get a few bad ones. It's a normal distribution.
Mm,
The majority of us are just average. You'd like to think that every single lecturer that the university hires would be able to wave a magic wand, and there'll be masters on stage, and they be able to capture the hearts of all the students. But no, most are just average, and that's
mm,
the case in all sorts of large bodies of workers, of employees, students that we get. The reality is the vast majority are just average. Yeah. You get your 10-15% who are HTs, you get your 10-15% who fail at either end. So given that that will always be the reality, um, most lecturers will just be average in terms of the ability to engage students in a classroom. And also, you combine that with the reality that um, most lecturers um, aren't incentivized to be good teachers,
hmm
because lecturers have two
Most
roles.
academics, maybe.
Yeah, most academics have two roles. And I'd say, for example, in banking and finance, 90% of lecturers are what they call T&R, teaching and research. In other words, they do both. However, the primary metric for promotion isn't how well they teach, it is how much research papers they produce.
Mm,
In fact, it is the primary metric for promotion or to keeping a job, not the quality of your teaching, but the research of output that you do. So in terms of the teaching and the research, it's mainly about the research as opposed to the teaching.
mhm.
Now that difference in incentives naturally skews the majority of academics, where uh, to get promoted, it's not because of the work they do in the classroom. It's
Mm,
because of their research output.
mhm.
Because of that, and combine that with most people are just average, it can result in and the outcomes are clear. Most lecturing experiences aren't really optimal.
No.
So I just wanted to add that to all the really
Yeah.
excellent points that you put in. Um, and you mentioned something very interesting as well, which was um, how students actually consume the lecture recordings in terms of, again, the performance is not optimal. I was actually talking about an optimal experience,
Mm,
but most students consuming online lectures aren't optimal. As you say, they fast forward it, or they say, right, I can do it in my own time. I'll actually forget to do it because I don't have to. You automatically miss out on that commitment that you have when you need to do something face to face. So
And like you said, you can just pause. You can go back. Let's say you need to do a quiz or whatnot. You can just pause and go back to that thing. You don't. There's not much real incentive for recall and engagement during the time of the lecture if you can just go back to it, depending on what the nature of the curriculum is.
absolutely. So, students, there is a percentage of the distribution of students which um, actually get lost, which aren't that engaged, aren't that motivated, don't have the self-discipline to provide for themselves the space, the discipline, the environment, so that what they consume in the lecture online is actually at the same level as they would if they were in a lecture theater, because that side of the argument would say that, well, um, you've dedicated a certain amount of time to be in the lecture theater. That's why you're there. So if you could be doing many other things, it costs you money to be on campus,
Mm.
and as a result, you should be more focused. You should be more disciplined. But the other side of the argument is then, some students will just turn up to the lecture just for the sake of it, and they'll be, on Facebook and watching episodes,
Mm.
streaming, even while they're in the lecture theater itself. So
Yeah.
you do get both things happening. But I think there's one important thing that you touched about that is quite unique to face-to-face lectures, and that is that ultimately we're talking about teaching, and teaching ultimately involves a human experience. And there's something which online consumption of content cannot provide, and that is human inspiration. So,
Mm.
for example, when I'm in a lecture theater, the students can see me face to face. And in the first lecture, I directly tell them the reason why I'm here is because I care about your education. It has an entirely different impact when I'm face to face with the student, looking them in the eye and telling them that, as opposed to they're watching a recording of me saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the online transfer of information loses that emotional resonance
Mm-hmm.
of physically being in the presence with someone. When psychologists have studied it, the difference between FaceTiming, in relationships, and the difference between physically being present with someone, uh, um, it, it it's literally different brain chemicals that are triggered.
Mm-hmm.
So going online loses that, and uh, um, before sometimes students speak of their good teachers, that their good teachers have inspired them. It is
Mm-hmm.
much more difficult to inspire students in a video
Mm-hmm.
camera, as opposed to physically
Mm-hmm.
being there with someone, to physically talking with it. So the asynchronous online material loses that. So that was actually one of the very big things and questions that we're currently struggling with in the design, in the reimagining, if you will, of how
Mm.
students consume asynchronous lecture content. How do we, number one, structure things in such a way so that it is not just the watching of a 2 hour lecture video. So it's not just a recording of a live lecture that the students will be consuming. It is dedicated material specifically designed to attempt to maximize the engagement of students, to create a situation where students do have to devote time and effort and discipline to
Mm-hmm.
create space for their learning. And there are activities that can create that for, again, for the majority of students. You never be able to do it for all, but again, when you're doing these things to scale, as we are at Monash, where my unit has, as you know, like 900 students in it. So
Mm.
again, you how can we move the distribution? How can you have the impact for the majority of students? And um, that's what we think about. So, for example, in terms of how do you try to connect better with students when you lose that with face-to-face communication? Um, we're having 2 or 3 minute motivational video at the start of every topic, where rather than, it's just a set of PowerPoint slides with a voiceover, the start of every set of asynchronous learning, which replaces the lecture, would be, for example, a selfie walk and talk video. I'm in a park, I'm taking a stroll through the park,
Mm.
and I'm just looking to the camera. Camera's on a selfie stick, and I just talk, greet students, and I talk a bit about why you're learning the particular topic, why it's important, how it fits in with prior topics, how it fits in with assessment, and just to have that mode of video communication, which people, it's a bit more casual, but it will enable us, I think, to, as a person, connect a bit more with students rather than the very typical clinical, sterile video environment or video that students typically see from a
Mm.
lecture. So we could have that, and then after that, there would be sort of different chunks of videos, um, interspaced with um, uh, questions, quizzing, interspaced with other different varieties of videos, such as animations, such as whiteboard, timeline drawings.
Hmm.
The
More interactive in a sense.
For example, like you see some of the very good uh, um, the pure content delivery material that lots of students have mentioned is like Khan Academy videos. Khan
Mm.
Academy videos, just a voiceover of a hand drawing. So we intermix everything up, but we also want to try and develop that sort of um, emotional connection with students as people, as educators, because the ultimate aim of this is not just the pure transmission of knowledge. The aim of the lecture is also the engagement of the students.
Hmm.
And the lecture is actually now just,
Student experience.
yeah, it's just one half, where the other half of the learning experience is to draw the students into the 2 hour tutorial, where they continue that learning, where we actually connect with them. We resonate. We are able to build those very unique face-to-face human connections. So it's meant to marry up with that. It's not a standalone experience as lectures before often were. I mean, you've got
Hmm.
the tutorial, but the tutorials are tacked on to the lectures. So this is
Mm.
so we have all these things in mind. Um, how do we um, have a asynchronous, non-face-to-face set of learning activities, not just the watching of a video, that enables and encourages students to be more engaged. And it's not just about the pure delivery of content anymore, which is the reason why lots of students were not coming to lectures, because they weren't interacting. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, so we do lose certain things, we gain certain things, and ultimately it is the recognition of the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, so as to try and build something which is better at the end. Because this is a big it's a big, massive project that we're embarking on.
Yeah. And those all sound like very admirable, and I hope and I think will be effective attempts to to create an optimal online experience, because that's always going to be difficult to make an online experience when we're not fundamentally not geared to an online experience, I guess, in many ways. I think it's probably worth just rewinding and touching back on the nature of the human connection and the intimacy and the inspiration that you get from the nature of lectures and a lecturer. Like, how many brilliant and productive people that have led meaningful lives have have come from a lecture theatre where they've been engaged and taught by a lecturer who they themselves, who has inspired them, who they have admired, and who has given them inspiration on what a topic could be, what a pursuit of knowledge could be like. how that might resonate with them, and then the kind of person they could be, the kind of character that they could have. And so I think that that is something that really, and that is really what is missing when you don't, let's say, when you have an average lecturer. I think when we're talking about, or someone like a great, I think you've got average lecturers, let's say, and not not being too denigrating to those people. Like I'm sure they're trying, and it's a difficult thing to do, right? But a like a great lecturer, I think you have average lecturers and then great lecturers. Like the people that I remember that have stood out to me, um, I just thought that they were fantastic. Like one person in particular that I had during a brief period for only one or two classes during my a chemistry degree. Content was all the same as it had been pretty much with previous people, but he came in and I don't know, he did something that was just like, man, this guy is so cool and he is making this topic so cool. And I suddenly care about it that much more. Um, and that, and so that should really be the goal, I think. And so I don't know, I guess this idea, well, there's an assumption here that, or a, maybe not an assumption, but a pathway that's been taken that it, instead of, okay, let's invest more into generating these in-person, making lecturers more engaging and successful in person, let's just simply let's not invest in that because that costs money and perhaps that's quite difficult and it doesn't align really with the incentives of the university, maybe the more fundamental incentives of the university. Let's just change the mode and not really have to, which also saves us money and um, allows us to just kind of go with the trend rather than to go with the flow, rather than to try and push back and really recreate something that is truly powerful. So, and I think, well, then that speaks to these other underlying motivations, which is the financial ones, which we haven't really talked about. Like this is all it's all well and good to talk about how um, lectures aren't working, but how much of this really is just coming down to financial perspective and a lack on the university's behalf to really invest into something that is known that can work but isn't working, rather than transitioning to something that we've got to try and make work. If that's a fair, I think that's a fair sort of scoping of things.
Yeah, I mean that's the ideal. So, for example, to create a learning experience, to create a university where the primary objective is to inspire students, which um, is ultimately, I would argue, the best outcome, because when students are inspired, they will themselves, they will internalize the learning, they'll be disciplined, they will apply themselves in such a way which cannot be replicated, and is the best sort of outcome. So uh, but that is an ideal. And in order to realize that ideal, um, you would have to have a university, for example, where you hire lecturers and you hire staff members purely based off, are you able to inspire a student? Yes, you're in. No, you're out. But academics aren't hired that way. 90% of the academics in most departments are research focused.
But why can't they be hired that way?
Uh, Again, that's a legacy of the educational system, because the this is a disconnect between the leadership of the university and this ideal of what education should be. And again, it's similar to the disconnects between, for example, the politicians and the people who are really at the grassroots. Um, and again, the disconnect between the very top and the bottom. It exists in many organizations, it exists in many populations, but ultimately, um, when the vice chancellors get up there, they get hired. They say, "Well, this is what I've got. I've got a population of 600 academics. What am I going to do? Am I going to fire them all and then rehire them based off how whether you inspire students? My research rankings, the rankings of the university ultimately come significantly influenced by the number of research papers in top tier journals that my university produces. How are we going to maintain our ranking if I just hire academics based purely on teaching? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so again, reality in this and other different ways hits home. And then
Mm.
if I mean, in an ideal world, I'd create my own university and I'd say, well, we are a university. This is our objective. We are here to inspire, to have the best teachers available to students. And a lot of people would say it is a rare unicorn that you get outstanding researchers and outstanding teachers overlapping. That overlap of the Venn diagram is almost non-existent because
Mm-hmm.
the type of skill sets you need to be a good researcher don't really complement the skill sets you need to be a good teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, to be a good teacher, you need to care about your students. And that caring comes from a very different place than people who want to be good researchers. Research ultimately is very selfish. It's not really altruistic. Most people are generating the research papers because they need to keep their job. Most people aren't that completely interested in what they're researching anyway. And it's very lonely. It does not involve engaging, speaking to, communicating with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students. It doesn't involve motivating them. So, given all these sorts of realities, um, we have the system that we have. I mean, um, in a fantasy, it'd be wonderful for I'm one of the 1 in 10 academics who's education focused. So it would be a fantasy for a billionaire to give me an endowment of $1 billion. I'd set at my own university, and I'd say we
Mm-hmm.
don't care about rankings. What we care about is giving you an amazing teaching experience for you to get an idea about what you will learn and for parents to give you an idea about what your children would learn. Instead of an open day, you'll just attend our classes for a day. So
Mm.
we're not going to market anything to you. You will actually see what we do. And part of that experience is a holistic education about intellectual, emotional maturity, understand and developing self-awareness, not just content delivery. So, and and I'd hire people who only have that as their priority. It's quite straightforward when you enter a lecture theatre, when you engage with a person to sense whether somebody genuinely cares about students' education.
Mm-hmm.
You get you can and students can tell very quickly and very easily as well too. And yeah, that would be an ideal world, but in a non-ideal world where we've got so many other considerations, and also most of our universities are government funded, and there are certain metrics that they require universities to meet, which
Mm-hmm.
aren't aligned to that ideal. That actually prevents that from occurring. So um, that's the reality.
Well, there's kind of a perverse. Well, there's a non-incentive for good teachers in that you don't have, even if you don't have good teachers from an inside perspective, kids are still going to go to university. You know, kids just aren't going to stop going to university just because the teachers aren't great necessarily. Like, and they won't know that probably until they're already in university and committed to that university and whatever it is that they're doing because they need the degree. Mostly it's just because they need the degree for some reason. Maybe they also like it too if they're lucky. but mostly it's because they kind of need the degree to be able to go and then do something onwards. And yeah, and I think just as a side note, what the public intellectual Jordan Peterson, I think the reason why he's part of the reason why he's so successful, speaking to that point that you were making before, is that he has that overlap of being a, a very successful and productive researcher, but also a fantastic teacher. An absolutely incredible form of communication and care. You can tell he's so passionate about telling you what you need to know about, and he weaves in practical knowledge and knowledge that has utility and is just baseline interesting in with, say, course material. And I think this is one of the things which has helped to make him so successful. And I think he's also trying to set up a mini university that's doing what you were saying, that doesn't have research outcomes as like a guiding metric. It's purely about giving the best course possible, educational experience possible, but which will be interesting if that works. But anyway, I think what I just touched on with the sort of practical, pragmatic experience, I think we also try to cram so much, if not dry, but then just very narrow, goal-directed content into such a short frame of time without giving any room for lectures and courses to be able to be a bit more interesting and maybe tangent off into something that's provides, that instills something along the lines of wisdom and knowledge and understanding and character development along those. There's just no, for most courses, there is just no room for that whatsoever. Not really. If you're lucky, you get something like you did at the start of the lecture where you were able to fit in like a 10-minute slide that you talk about, which can in itself can be enough. But that's sort of really all you could do. I also think like 2 hours, 2 hours as a lecture, I think that's probably a bit suboptimal in terms of, I think 1 hour, people start to lose their capacity, their cognitive capacity a little bit. So just as a little note. But yeah, well, I guess, I mean, how do you feel about all this personally? Like, you're a lecturer, you're not going to be able to lecture anymore. Like,
Well,
how do you feel?
I mean, this is where you go through those stages in your life where um, the environment that you're involved in, that your work evolves in such a dramatic fashion that you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do? Do you, and ultimately, my the core idea, the core motivation behind why I'm at work is I've great clarity about it. It's because I think there's nothing better I can do with my time than helping young people be smarter, be more self-aware through education. And um, ultimately, the university is saying that we're going to do this. Uh, I originally had misconceptions about it, as any inertia would provide. And then, can you adapt? Can you actually say, well, okay, if we remove the lectures, we lose this. How can we try in the new system to develop a set of learning activities which is limited to only one mode, but loses the least, or in aggregate gains the most? You have to be in the game to be able to play the game. So for me, it was just a very quick sort of um, evolution to say that, well, I completely understand the reasons for what's happening. Um, I want to be involved in the project so I can, in my small way, influence it so that it has the best outcome. So yeah, I'm going to take it on board, and I'm going to do as good a job as I can with it,
Hmm.
so that it it loses the least possible and it gains the most.
Right.
So that's the way in which I've adapted. There's certain people which won't be able to adapt, and it's up to them to decide how they want to handle their work. But yeah, uh, I've decided to take that attitude, which uh, um, aligns, still enables me to be true to my motivation.
I
So
guess
it has, yeah, because I've got
that's
clarity as to why I'm doing this, and
mm,
if this is the way that we're moving, I can understand why they are, for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, genuine reasons as to why. Yeah, I want to be in it so that I can influence the outcome, and that naturally, as part of the system where people choose to opt in that fashion, does make the outcome better, as
mm.
opposed to other people who don't recognize possibly the inherent flaws and attempt to compensate or attempt to correct, or can maybe even completely overcome them.
I just don't think of that. They just don't think about it at all. Just do it.
Well, I've been, as part of this entire process, I've been working with lots of education designers who have a lot more um, classroom scholarly pedagogy knowledge, but they aren't in the classroom. And ultimately, they've been suggesting things out of very good intentions. They've suggested some very, very good things, but they've also suggested directions which I know won't work.
Hmm.
So, because of the sort of considerations that I mentioned. So, as a result, I've been there to be able to influence the process to create outcomes that ultimately are compromises, but um, as all these big projects need to be. But ultimately, I think would be better, and would create a better result in terms of, for example, um, maintaining, or trying to retain, or trying to direct students to keeping that human touch in terms of teaching. Like for example, I'm not going to try to pretend that a set of asynchronous online activities can inspire students, but what a set of very engaging online asynchronous activities can do is to make students more motivated to attend class, or better yet, direct students into consultation,
Hmm.
for example, or with other staff. So yeah, things like that can be done, and ultimately that uplifts the entire result.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very pragmatic and admirable approach because obviously what it suggests is that you genuinely do have the students' well-being and outcome in mind, and it's not just picking a fight with what you think is right or wrong. You're getting on with it.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, nobody's perfect and nobody's indispensable, and ultimately, if I'm able to create a good outcome of this project, which addresses some or most of the concerns that we've raised, then this particular it can be used as a role model and an example for when this is replicated throughout other units.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, it's better to have skin in the game and to be playing the game, and to engage it from that perspective as opposed to opting out.
Mm. Well, this is only because I guess this is only kind of one side of the story. This is lectures. Lectures are a very significant part of a university, and a course, but perhaps even more significant, or at least definitely from the student's perspective, um, is exams. And so, as you mentioned last time we spoke, least in the Monash Business School, because you mentioned that that's where this is kind of starting, and that's where Monash makes the most revenue, and so that's where things get trialed out top down and then trickle down through the rest of the various disciplines and schools. Exams are being, if maybe I'll try to recap what you said to me. So exams are being eliminated from the curriculum for a few reasons. Firstly, students are failing exams. Students aren't, well, maybe not students are, students fail exams. Exams have a decently high fail rate. They're a incredibly stressful time in throughout a student's learning life. They encourage this form of learning and knowledge uptake that is very condensed, very frantic, and then doesn't necessarily lead to any retention after the exam. So the efficacy of the exam is called into question, as you mentioned also at the beginning of this podcast. And it's also a very costly enterprise for the university to host exams. So we've got, again, as we've kind of been circling around for this whole conversation, there's two motivating factors or determining factors. One is cost, and the other is at least the purported efficacy of the pedagogy in question. So let's start with the revenue side and then go. What do you think is most at play here?
I think they're both equally at play because these decisions are being driven by management, and they consider both equally.
Mm.
Ultimately, if a deputy vice chancellor is hired with the objective of number one, and anybody hired onto, for example, that level, which is the executive board of director level, the reason why to bring them on board is because they can say, well, I can increase revenue while at the same time reducing costs. So
Yeah.
that's from the pure business perspective. And they say, how are you going to do that? And say, here's how I'm going to do that. And this particular strategy of doing that is not only makes business sense, but also aligns exactly with the outcomes and making us better aligned with the other outcomes that the organization has, and then everybody claps their hands and say yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't, in my opinion, one more than another. It is both equally woven into a narrative that that leadership puts forward, and then is recognized as genuine, and therefore is filtered out throughout the entire university. So the the anecdotal and the empirical evidence is without any doubt, and that's best summed up with the experience, where, for example, you've got units, subjects which are prerequisite for other units, and then in those latter units, you say, well, you should know this because you've done this before in the prerequisite subject, and the student says, oh, I forgot everything after I finished the exam.
Mm-hmm.
That's just something which students have repeated over the whole 20 years I've been at Monash University. So again, it is very compelling evidence, proven empirically and anecdotally, that exams aren't having the sort of ultimate goal of assessment that we want them to have. So the university has branded assessment as authentic or inauthentic. So authentic assessment should be assessment which, number one, is developing real workplace skills. Number two, it is encouraging students learning that is authentic, in the sense of students aren't just learning for the sake of the assessment. The assessment is done for the sake of learning. And the issue with exams before in the past is not, that's not true of the entire cohort, but a lot of the cohort was studying just for the exam, just to pass the exam. They don't care about what they're learning, particularly for closed book exams, particularly when we're dealing with the large chunk of the middle distribution of students. They're not studying for the sake of learning. They're not studying for the sake of using the knowledge, of appreciating its value, of seeing how it can be applied, and the process of which opens up more neural pathways in their brain and therefore makes them smarter in terms of developing critical or independent thinking. They're not doing it for that. So, for all these reasons, exams, the university and the leadership is saying that exams are not authentic assessment. And because when students go out to work, the vast majority of them don't sit exams as part of their workplace KPIs, as part of what they have to do at work. So it is inauthentic. The way in which we've been justifying exams before in the past is that it is simply the easiest way to assess students to scale. How do you? So ultimately, in my opinion, one of the best ways of assessment is to have a 1 or 2 hour interview with students. So I'd come in and I'd say, right, okay, we're going to have an interview. And I'm going to ask you certain things, and how you articulate to me, how you express yourself, would, those series of questions, rather than ask them in a written form where the students have to respond to an exam, I'd ask you face to face. And then we'd have a conversation about it. And then there would be other components where, so you have to do calculations, for example. So let's calculate this. All right. And then you're given 50 minutes to calculate. And then next is, okay, now you used to use Excel to model this. All right. And then we have a discussion. So what do you think is the outcomes? How will we use this information? So to me, that would be the best form of assessment, where you can actually make the assessment authentic. You could tailor it to really seeing whether the student understands.
That's not scalable, though.
We can't do that to scale. How do you do that across, for example, the 1,000 students that I have every semester? So exams they've always been done. We've always had exams because it is the easiest way to scale assessment to hundreds of students, to thousands of students, and it hasn't really paid attention to all these other concerns, because then the people who do exams will say, but yeah, if we don't have exams, how else would you measure whether students reach a hurdle, reach a benchmark? It's been a very simple, purely quantitative metric. So what the university's actually done is to be more authentic to the question of, are our students actually learning anything through assessment? Is our assessment driving students' learning outcomes, as opposed to students just studying for assessment? It's made our job more authentic. It's made our job harder by taking away this very easy sort of crutch that we've been leaning on all this time. And the only way to do that is that you have to force the change. You have to mandate the change. No more exams. So, and that has to be done at the highest level. Because if that wasn't done, then we would be doing exams, 100 years later on. And we say, yeah, we know that exams aren't really authentic, but it's the way that we've always been doing things, and as a result, we're not going to change because it's too hard. So, yeah.
Well, I guess part of the reason why this is so interesting is because there's so many implicit assumptions that are kind of just being worked with here that aren't in the old system, and then also with this new process. So, for example, you said that some units, the learning is for the sake of the assessment rather than the assessments for the sake of learning. I think that's right. Yeah. So, but that is assuming as well that you get rid of the exam and students still aren't doing the assessments, aren't learning for the sake of the assessments rather than doing the assessments for the sake of the learning. Just getting rid of the exam isn't going to somehow flip that around. So how many students are just doing a course just because that's what they've got to do, and they feel like they need to do, and they're kind of interested in it. Maybe they're really interested in it, and that's great. But that's not the majority, frankly, particularly not throughout an entire degree. Um, and so there's that assumption there that taking out exams is going to somehow is going to alter that. Um, then there is well, firstly, I guess I'm a little skeptical that on the sincerity and the ability of students to self-report on their own feelings and subjects on this matter, because there's so many conflicting reasons of why you might say something about an exam. Students don't like exams. They're hard, they don't feel great, and they it's one more avenue for failure. If a question feels geared towards, do you learn something from exams? Oh no, fuck that. Exams are useless. That's not necessarily, I forget everything. Well, if you don't do an exam, how do you know you're not just forgetting everything as well? So there isn't necessarily an answer for that or a justification for that, just like in the previous question. And so that then goes to the question of, okay, well, if I'm just doing more assessments in term, which is the proposal here, and I only need to learn a topic for a week, and then the next week I learn a different topic, I can just forget about that topic the week after. And how is that any different from forgetting about that topic or those topics after an exam? The thing about the exam is that it's at least forced you to go over that topic twice, and maybe it is in quite an intense period, and so the efficacy of that is also in question. But you could, hypothetically, it's not unreasonable to think that having to go over a topic twice is going to be more effective than going over a topic once, regardless of the purported retention of that knowledge afterwards. And I'm not necessarily defending exams. I'm not sure what I think about exams. I think they probably have their uses and their downfalls, but I guess I'm not convinced that these reasons that are being put forth for the elimination of exams are actually particularly well justified. They're just sort of these observations that there's kind of these notional observations. And so, I'm fascinated to see how that does actually change things. I know that students will love not having exams, and maybe that will make them feel more engaged. I had a unit that in chemistry that didn't have exams, and I really enjoyed it. Did I retain more than my other units? I'm not sure. Can't remember. It's and that's going to so often be the case, I think. So I guess it's all of this is really difficult, and there's all these nice assumptions that seem to be aimed at pedagogy, purport to pedagogy, improved pedagogy, and outcomes for students. But that the only real, but when you look at it, the only real concrete outcomes that you know are going to be the case is that the university is going to have to spend less,
Oh
and
yes,
that more kids are going to pass their units, and that
yeah,
is going to look good for the university. So when
yeah,
on one hand you've got all these unsupported notions all these assumptions that sound great but aren't necessarily proven, and then all these concrete realities that are financially driven, it's hard to not be a little
cynical.
cynical about the whole enterprise.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. These concrete political gains,
Mm,
not as an outcome of genuinely better performance and better learning, but just as an artifact of the mechanism of not having exams, more students will pass for sure,
mm,
right? And again, it's one of the things that you don't really talk about, because it then casts doubt on the authenticity of the entire process. But
mhm,
again, uh, you know, like so many of the things which happens, politics is a driving factor. So again, ultimately, there is one thing, one genuine thing, though, that I believe has come out of this process. Exams weren't perfect. The people who were for exams would say that we know that this sort of works. We don't have any other system, so we'll just continue on with it. So, what has happened for political reasons? Definitely part of it is for political reasons, but I also think for a genuine alignment of motives uh, uh, to try to do something better, the entire anthill was kicked over.
Mm-hmm.
And when the anthill is kicked over, it says that, right, we need to break out of the inertia because we have a new deputy vice chancellor and new people are brought in to break the inertia. Whether the inertia needs to be broken or not, that's another matter. But when things are kicked over like this, when change is forced, then it gives the people like me who are brought onto the unit to this project to say, well, okay, I understand the concerns that students are learning for the assessment and the assessments aren't driving the learning. So now that we have to go back to scratch, go back to the drawing board, we don't have exams anymore. How do we redesign within semester assessment so that assessment is done to drive learning?
Mm.
So it forces us to go back to the drawing board. It forces us, or at least it gives us the opportunity to embark on an opportunity of renewal.
Mm.
At least it gives us that. And ultimately, will it result in better outcomes? As an artifact of the mechanism, yeah, sure. But will it really result genuinely in students having better learning outcomes? We won't know if we don't try. So again, maybe we do this for 10, 20 years. And then us who are doing it will know whether it generates genuinely better outcomes when we're honest with ourselves. And part of whether it does generate more authentic learning outcomes is based off how well a job we do with it. Is there the possibility that it can generate better learning outcomes? Absolutely. So one of the things that automatically when we say to students, okay, you do not have a closed book hurdle rate exam anymore, students will automatically breathe a sigh of relief. Oh,
Yeah,
God, I don't have
it's
to
true.
memorize anymore. I don't have to, to spend the hours just trying to remember a fact that I'm completely uninterested in,
Mm-hmm.
just for the sake that it might come out on the exam. So that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why students forget about it. We can say to students, we know how this assessment affects you, but we know you're breathing a sigh of relief, but your sigh of relief isn't based on the fact that your education will necessarily get easier because you still need to pass. So we then know that your attention, instead of being laser focused on, I need to get 50% on this to pass, will then be focused on the progression of assessment. You'll be paying attention to, right, how am I doing in my weekly quiz? And in order to do this on my weekly quiz, then I need to be learning the material actually so that I get a mark on my weekly quiz, which means I pass.
I
Or,
can focus on that material a lot
yeah,
more effectively in that week.
exactly. The focus, the mind, because every students and all we have limited mind space. The mind space isn't focused on, I just only care about passing the exam. The mindset we can say to students, you 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 can't focus your mindset on just passing the exam because we've got no more exams. You need to focus on the actual weekly learning material that we're doing. Why? Because we have, for example, instead of a big exam, we have fortnightly mini tests. Yep,
Mm.
they're worth 4%. But if you sort of fall over in the first two, we can then say that, right, you need to hit 50%. This is the minimum level you need to pass. You're currently here.
Yeah.
In your last three tests, you need to buck up.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to your assignments, the assignments suddenly mean a lot more, because if you're not doing well, then
Yeah.
we can then have a renewal in terms of how we reshape students' expectations, and say to them, right, in your assignments, you should aim to get as good a mark in the work that you're doing for the assignments, because this is actually your learning.
Yeah.
No exam. All right. And students who fall over, for example, in one assignment, we can say, well, you need to really back up for the second assignment, isn't it? And for the second assignment, it can involve learning from, like as in our foundations assignment, the second assignment involves learning from almost all the previous topics. And we also have a test, but that test is like a mini exam held at the end.
Mm.
It's, for example, 30% instead of 50%, and you don't have to
Yeah.
pass it.
Yeah.
So we still have that test, which requires application from every single topic that they've learned, but it doesn't have a hurdle, and it's of a
Mm-hmm.
much lower weightage.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it supports the realignment of focus to the actual learning within semester. So I completely agree that objective is entirely authentic, and I think that would
Mm.
can result in better outcomes.
I think I would probably tend to agree. Like something depends on the topic at hand and mode of assessment at hand, but you're able to spend some time sitting, thinking, and writing in a comfortable space um, for an assessment, that is going to be far more informative and instructive, I think, than stressfully cramming information out and spitting it out on a test. Like the power of writing and thinking, having to think deeply about something over an extended period is not something to be undervalued at all. And I think exams are a little unrealistic in the sense that they expect you to, let's say you're a typical student, you've got 4 units in a semester, maybe you're doing 3, but let's say you're doing 4. Let's say all 4 units have exams, and you have got to cram in, and you don't know what's going to be on the exam, so you've got to somehow account for, maybe you have an idea, but you don't really know, and you have to account for 12 weeks of learning across 4 units. You know, you've got to account for 48 weeks of learning in a sense into a few documents spread over a couple weeks. And now that on its head just doesn't seem particularly effective, and it's going to be stressful. And so I guess that speaks to what you were saying before with that sigh of relief, is that if you don't, just simply not having an exam at the end where you know that's going to be the case allows you to be a little freer and a little more relaxed, which I think is going to encourage better learning in those moments within semester, in during from week to week. So, regardless of all those assumptions, which I think are fair and need to be considered, and aren't necessarily justified, but I think I would still lean towards the fact of exams not being optimal or just optimized towards learning. Like, you're not a hard drive. You shouldn't really have to be a hard drive. And that's what the exam modality kind of is. So,
Yeah, exactly. And when I think about in the workplace, people inherently become content experts. They become content experts not by memorizing. They become content experts through the constant application of the
mhm,
knowledge in multiple changing, involving dynamic perspectives. That's how they
Yeah.
become content experts. And when we can try and apply that
Hmm.
reality throughout 12 weeks of learning, where you are consistently applying rather than exam, because ultimately everything is
Hmm.
you can talk about whatever high-minded sort of learning objectives that you have, but ultimately students say, yeah, but I just want to pass the exam. um
Exactly. And or I just want to pass the unit. I want to pass
yeah,
my
I
degree.
just want to pass. I just want to pass. And so again, these are I've latched on to this objective, which I think is bona fide 100% authentic. And now we have the opportunity, because the anthill has been kicked over. We will never do this if we were not forced to do it. The entire anthill is kicked over. I have an opportunity to shape
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
so we can genuinely achieve this objective. And ultimately, we'll see. Because the only way we will know whether this can have a better result is when we try it. And over a series of time, when it's refined, when it's we look at it, we reflect, we improve, it evolves, then we can say. So if we were just in the pure exam paradigm without it, we don't have the evidence to say that, which is better, exams or
Hmm.
no exams. So now, it's that it's genuine to me, because we're trying the other way, and where there are genuine reasons for trying the other way, we are we'll have the information, we'll give it the best shot that we can. Genuine, honestly, I think we can do it. And then we'll see. We'll be able to compare the results after an extended period of time. And that to me is authentic.
Well, I hope they are good changes, and I hope it does go well. And I do definitely appreciate what you're saying in that, in terms of it's an opportunity to shake things up and to try something new and to perhaps to get something better out of things. And I hope that is the case and that is supported, because it's not just that we're getting rid of exams, as you're going to a more online forum. So those two things, one, get rid of exams could be great, but maybe an online forum kills things a bit. Who knows? Hopefully they don't cancel each other out. Hopefully they can both work effectively, because I think anything that can be done at a university to make students more motivated, more engaged, more inspired, um, to be there and to just about life in general, and to not have to offset the 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 trials of their experience with all the hedonistic activity that comes with youth, and to be a bit more forward thinking, maybe a bit more optimistic, a bit more aligned with the notion of character development, they say emotional, intellectual, the the, the appreciation of wisdom, civic virtue, all of those things. Anything that universities can do to improve the experience for the student, I think, is needs to be done, and should be done. So if that's something that you're capable of achieving and setting to whatever extent, and setting a new standard for the other faculty, then that's a good thing. And to speak to that point, I suppose, and maybe to kind of start to wrap things up a little bit, what do you think is important for uni students to consider, to think about? What? Yeah, let's leave it at that.
Well, I personally think that it's my job. Definitely, it's my personal aim to help as many students as possible realize that their university education can be so much more than what they expected. How do you communicate the idea of inspiration self epiphany, and self awareness. You can't. It has to be an experience that you do go through. Um, but I think to the answer to your question is really going back to trying to engender uh, the mode and style of thinking of understanding why. Why am I doing this? What do I wish to get out of it? And ultimately, you mentioned with all the other hedonistic activities out there, I've always been encouraged. I mean, over the span of 2 decades, I have genuinely seen the younger generations be more capable. It's not just lip service. As the successive generations come through, they have every generation has their own unique challenges. But as successive generations of students have come through, I have seen them, maybe because they are more freed from in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you've got the very basic needs. The students
Mm-hmm.
nowadays are more comfortable. They are freed from the concerns of needing to satisfy their basic needs. More and more of them are able to say, well, what am I here? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? I see the greater capacity and interest um, to develop self-awareness at a younger age than older generations, and that gives me great optimism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when we try and align education to be holistic, to include explorations, reflections of motivation to build self-awareness, I think that I'm very optimistic on the overall outcomes that this achieves.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, to answer your question directly, um, especially now with the lifting of the burden of having to pass an exam, we can focus more on that question. Students will have
Yeah.
more headspace to focus on the question. When I ask students, why are you here? I don't care. I just have to pass the exam. No exam to pass. So you can answer this question. Why are you here? Why are we learning all these things? Is there value? Like for example, when we teach about upcoming topics about regulation, we can frame it from the perspective of um, financial regulation. And these are rules that you have to follow. It's not just rules you have to follow. It's why do we have these rules we have to follow? What are the outcomes of not having these rules to follow? How much rules should we follow? What type of rules should we have in place? And we can
Mm.
directly link them to financial crises, and even what's happening right now, the collapse of three banks in the United States, and um, other things which are happening, to say, well, yeah, so you have a far more intrinsic, genuine appreciating, understanding of this, rather than financial regulation are just rules that we have to follow, and it's created by
Mm-hmm.
these people, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Much more freedom to think. It's certainly not a bad thing, and I think that it speaks to what I would probably suggest to students is that to begin to start paying attention, really start to pay attention to themselves, who they are, who they're who they're becoming. So what it is that makes them who they are at that point in time, how they what they think is what they think is important, what their values are, what what gives them cause for either happiness or unhappiness in life at those points in time. And also to pay attention in particular to what they might think is meaningful or worthwhile and worth doing with their time. And part of that is starting to take things seriously. Start to take, I think encourage people to not, and youth to not really start taking life and themselves seriously until quite a much later age than is perhaps optimal. Start taking yourself seriously in terms of what you're doing from day to day, how you go about thinking about yourself and other people, your the nature of where you are in relation to the future that you envisage, that you might want to envisage, and to start to envisage something like a future, to begin to take aim at something, to find something that you admire, and to move towards it, because you're going to need something along those lines in life. And even if it's realizing, paying attention and realizing, why am I actually doing this degree? And asking yourself that question, and then that leading to the cascade of questions that leads you to uncover actually who you think you are as a person and what you think you should be doing with your time and what you think is worthwhile. And I think that will, and then to interrogate in particular what it is, as I mentioned before, that makes me unhappy or is making me less than I could be. And I think all those things serves to encapsulate it under the hood of simply paying attention and starting to take things seriously is what allows students and young people more broadly to orient themselves properly and to live a better life than they might otherwise. So I guess that's where I'd probably leave that. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Jason?
No, I think we covered everything, with great depth and breadth today in terms of the topic at hand. So that's great to you, Lucian. Well done.
Yeah, well, no, thank you. That was fantastic conversation and topic that I'm probably interested in more than most people, just for pure for academic reasons. But I think it's very interesting and has a lot of potential in terms of its consequence. Um, so definitely interested to see how this plays out, and to touch base in the future to see to reflect on just how things have gone, particularly in terms of how we've talked about them now. So if you're willing to do that at some point, I think that'd be fantastic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this will be rolled out next semester, so we're not talking about something which is pie in the sky. It's happening right now, and um, we're actually developing and creating all the material, all the new things this semester to roll out
Mm.
next semester, and I think over the next 3 semesters we will be shaping it, refining it. The what comes out next semester is definitely not the final product. It can't be
Hmm.
after such a momentous change. It has to be molded. We've got to reflect on it. We've got to see how it actually works. So, but yeah, it's something that's really happening right now.
Yeah, well, looking forward to talking about it more in the future. Thanks,
Yeah,
Jason.
no worries, no worries.